Milk flinched as the 3 cadets facing her all dropped as one, their weapons still trained on her form. Before the shots finished echoing around the cave, 2 figures appeared out of the fog and brush. Both were tall, well-built women, with the physique that the Irish lady noticed only appeared on the veteran Marines. Their perfectly smooth bodysuits, harnesses, and odd face masks identified them instantly as Death's Head Commandos. Although those bodysuits were zipped up and not showing off their rock-hard abs, it took a bit of time to connect from the action movies Patrol sometimes played and the living legend standing in front of her. One held what looked to be a laser shotgun, and as she wrapped the slide, an energy cell like the ones used in WSO's pistols was ejected, its power meter reading empty. The other carried a long gun with a collapsed scope clamped under her right arm, and was in the process of holstering the heavy pistol she carried in her left, both barrels steaming in the mists. Milk kept her pistol up and raised at the 2 new people. "Friendlies?" she finally asked after a tense, for her, standoff. One of them nodded, as the other brought a hand up to the side of her mask and seemed to talk into it. Milk let her pistol drop as she looked at the downed interior cadets. Every single one had a burn mark that she knew from experience came from a stun shot right where the helmet ended and the environmental seal began. A dangerous shot because of how close it was to the spine, but as the WSO knelt down and took a closer look, she noticed that each shot hit just off center of that perfect target, ensuring that the stun had to travel through suit and flesh before hitting vulnerable nerves. Perfectly safe and insanely effective. Her regard for their marksmanship skyrocketed. There were a pair of sharp snaps that made Milk's head pop up and look around before locking onto the sniper, who was bringing her other hand down from her ear. The marks were motioned for the WSO to move over to her, holding up a small chip. The chip was something familiar to the patrol cadet. Since updating IFFs on the field through a broadband download was asking for the enemy to insert some malware, single-use IFF chips were given out to update a soldier's HUD and radio frequencies in an emergency or in time for a full download isn't available. Milk took the thumb-sized high-tech USB drive and plugged it into the slot in the back of her helmet. Cookie called it the Cortana slot. She waited for the small progress bar at the bottom left of her HUD to fill up, and then waited another split second as the pod leader accepted the new connection, before taking in all the new intel. She looked between the 2 commandos and noticed the sniper was marked as Bet, while the shotgunner was identified as Gimmel. She gave the 2 a nod and checked that her radio is connected to the local squad channel before speaking up. "So, friendlies, what's the plan?" In front of her eyes, a single line appeared in the HUD, directing her onward into the forest as a pair of commandos talked with a rapid-fire set of hand signals. Milk sighed and began to follow the marker. The command center was in uproar. Ever since the mission started, the normally rock-solid communication and observation equipment began being plagued with faults. First, there was a segment of 30 minutes where all contact was lost with the interior cadet's gunship, before coming back right as they left. Then any audio began to be hit with static, making it nearly impossible to understand what was being discussed. Then the video feed started to flicker out. It was almost enough for Talfrin to call the entire operation off and send in a relief force to find them and see what was going on with the communication equipment. But pressure from their interior compatriots forced her to recant that suggestion. The mission would continue. And then the feeds completely dropped. Audio, visual, even the backup trackers flickered out. The command center even lost contact with the gunship, circling above the group. It took one of the interior advisors pulling rank, seniority and a pistol to keep Simmons from leading the rescue party herself, and even keeping a rescue party from existing. So when the senior drill matron did what all officers do when they are relieved of duty by bullshit orders, they went outside to smoke and make a discreet call to troops loyal to them. Taking a drag from the herbal cancer stick, the old shill thumbed a subdermal switch that turned on the microphone grafted into her bone for this specific reason. Sometimes it paid to have subvocal mics hidden within medical implants. "Please tell me you aren't as blind as we are. Interior seems to be making a move and I can't get in there without them claiming I'm hysterical and selling my ass on medical grounds." There was a silence which was to be expected. Sending a message on an encrypted radio, powered by a capacitor hooked up to a tiny turbine connected to your heart, down through hard atmosphere, and decrypted by a commando stealth shuttle took some time. It was around a minute before a response came back in the clipped, semi-garbled, purposely mechanical, masked, and might as well have been text-to-speech voice that these commandos loved. Both VIBs contacted, 1 secure. 4 HVTs contacted, 3 secure. And that was it. but it was enough. Simmons thumbed her throat again, switching to another line. Secondary confirmation. Go. There was no reply this time. The commando placed the recorder at her belt, keeping the pistol trained at Triumph and 4's belly at a low ready. The child of Orlon could barely believe she had been caught like this. By a commando of all things. Who were these humans? Now, I believe we're both rational women, let's not be hasty here. Her own rifle was still set to medium power, nothing good enough to punch through the top-of-the-line commando armor her opponent wore. I'm sure we can come to some kind of an agreement. My mother is quite rich, and I'm sure you're not being paid nearly enough, and we can work out some kind of deal, right? The commando paused at that. Maybe she'll take the offer. Triumph and 4 thought, still shaking. She wasn't fit to deal with commandos. Her older sister went to work at TF-12, but would only talk about the mopping. Nothing about how to negotiate with commandos. The commando took a step forward, and Triumph and 4 took a step back. She could feel her hands shaking around her rifle, finger fidgeting inside the trigger well. The commando took another step forward, and she took a step back. The commando slowly began to raise her pistol from the low aim to a proper shooting stance. Triumph and 4 panicked. Earlier in the game, when they realized they'd have a gunship on standby, they figured out a way to signal the ship. Simply by pressing the panic button on her wrist, the gunship would fly low and slow over the AO, forcing their opponent to break for cover. All it would take is Triumph and 4 to touch her wrist without shaking. She stared at the commando as her hand began to slowly shift towards her wrist, only a few more inches. The pistol's power was notched up with an audible hum. Triumph and 4 froze in fear. Fear is a unique emotion. It can spur people to the highest of bravado to the lowest of cowardice. Enough fear can make someone who would normally turn tail and run fight until they die. Enough can make someone who would have held until their last break in terror. But there's one thing fear always does, from the bravest man to the most graven coward. Fear makes you stupid. Triumph and 4 shot the commando 3 times in the chest while diving to the side in an attempt to avoid the return shot from the pistol. The handcrafted armor barely changed colour from the lower power bursts, but the commando flinched back on instinct, training forcing her to seek cover. And she was gone. Breathing hard, Triumph and 4 sprinted for the woodline, heart pounding and lungs burning. In her panic, she never looked back at the human she left lying on the ground. Never looked as he reached into his boot and pulled out a keen blade. Never looked back as he flipped it in the air to hold it by the tip and brought his arm back. It was a bad posture, a bad position, a nigh impossible target. Ryan Kennedy had hit them before. Triumph and 4 was mid-stride when she felt 7 inches of earth-forged steel punch through the back of her knee, severing tendons and shattering fragile bone right before the interior cadet landed hard, putting her full running weight on the ruined knee. Her leg crumpled and she hit the ground, screaming in pain. Cookie sat there, breathing heavily, as the commando took a second look at him. His arm was outstretched, fingers pointed ever so slightly down, with his arm pointing right at the back of the cadet's leg. He crawled carefully up to his feet, trying not to put too much pressure on his wounded leg, as the commando nodded in approval, and the pair moved as one. Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, Ryan offered. It was my great-grandfather's when he was in the OSS, passed down through family, probably the first time it was used in 30 years. The commander gave no reply, but when they arrived at the screaming shill, the masked woman knelt down and put a single shot of stun energy into the cadet's neck before pulling the knife out and bandaging the wound. Cookie bounced his uninjured leg up and down, leaning against a tree to watch her do her work. The commando took a second look at the knife, dancing it across her fingers before offering it back to the pilot. "Thanks," he said, wiping the blue-tinged blade off of his sleeve before putting it back into his boot holster. She nodded before handing over an IFF chip to plug in. It was almost a relief when the HUD popped up with directions and an alert. All HVTs negated, all VIPs acquired. And then Senwin's voice came over his radio, and he froze. "Cadets McDermott and Kennedy, this is not a drill. If it has not dawned on you yet, you were attacked by members of the Interior. We both know why. Work with the commandos. This is a recording. You cannot reply." Cookie found himself clutching the pistol tighter. He assumed it, but to have it spelled out for him by a superior officer, that was different. The troop ship back was quiet. It had been an easy affair to deal with the Interior gunship. It showed up and flashed its guns, and then the Commando stealth ship appeared above it and flashed its much bigger guns, and that was that. The pilot was grounded and critical components ripped from the engine, rendering it useless. Milk was bouncing her leg as she watched the 4 commandos get dressed. Sure, they already had been wearing those almost latex-like bodysuits that seemed to change colour when you looked at them for a long time, but they had quickly and professionally stripped out of them and were in the process of putting on something significantly more bulky. Their masks were never removed, although the Irish pilot did see some brief flashes of metal where their ears should be that implied the masks were less masks and more helmets with wigs, something that seemed significantly smarter than going into combat without head protection. Unlike most Navy SEALs, these commandos oozed professionalism in every movement they made without making a sound. True silent professionals. Milk watched, trying not to drool, as the Shorvanti at the peak of their physique started putting on the heaviest armour she'd ever seen worn in the military. Thick layers of rough, almost rubbery-looking materials covered their body as metallic strips and plates covered vital areas and held the equipment together. To the pilot's untrained eyes, these heavy suits looked like something out of Crisis rather than B-movie sci-fi than the armour they previously wore. And then they started patting each other on the back and running their hands over the sides and curves of each other's armour. To anyone but pilots and paratroopers, the acts looked incredibly sexual. Almost like the commanders were about to start stripping each other, but the pair quickly noticed familiar patterns. They were checking each other's gear. Straps and connectors were tightened. Hard-to-reach attachment points were fixed in place. Material was smoothed down, and it was done in complete silence before what the HUD identified as Strike Lead snapped her fingers twice, and the group started going through stretches in perfect unity. Milk turned away from this sight as Cookie slapped her in the back of the helmet. The pilot, only slightly more talkative than the commander she was ferrying, called 3 minutes into the troop compartment, and the special operations soldiers instantly stopped their stretchers to strap in. There was a barely perceivable bump, and the slight hum of the gravity engine died down as the back hatch opened up to allow a single-figure entrance to the shuttle. She was shorter than most Shill, which meant she was still a good head or two taller than the pilots, and instead of combat armour, she wore the Shorvanti equivalent of a suit and pencil skirt. The normal brass-like chest plate had been replaced with one of the pure purplish alloy, and the letters ITAD censored across the top like police on a SWAT vest. She looked to the commandos and gave a nod as they unbuckled and stood up, giving one last check, and then heading out the still open back hatch. She then turned to the pair of pilots and spoke up. "Cadets McDermott and Kennedy, you are both witnesses and evidence in an investigation into the actions of the Orlon dynasty. My name is Shrablada. I am a senior investigator for the Imperial Tithe Assessment Department, and you were rescued by commandos seconded into my service." They had been rescued by the IRS.